Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Welcome to hashtag What the Patriarchy, where we are working to completely uproot the patriarchy from Islam. Hashtag inshallah, hashtag it's ambitious, I know, but we got this. Thank you so much for being here. This is Shahnaz. Okay, so today we're going to talk about another classic book in the study of Islam. It's called Sexual Ethics and Islam, Feminist Reflections on Qur'an, Hadith, and Jurisprudence. And it's by the Kecia Ali. This is the 2016 edition that we'll be talking about. It was first published in 2006. And when I was taking my notes on this book for this vlog, I literally wrote more than 30 pages of notes. And I refuse for my time and for those notes to go to waste. So we're going to do separate episodes on just a couple of chapters at a time for this book. In this video, we're going to talk only about the introduction, the main points of the book, some of the main points of the book, the introduction and chapter 1. So I've read this book many times since the very first time I read it, which was in 2008. And I have never met anyone who has read the book, who actually has read the book, who doesn't like the book. I have met plenty of people who have never read the book and don't like it because, that's a thing that exists. I know folks who teach contemporary Islam courses who have never read this book. Like, can you really call yourself a scholar of Islam or a researcher of Islam at all if you have never read this book or if you don't know this book? The answer is obviously no. But people think that if the word gender or women or sexuality or feminism appears in the title of a book, then you can't assign it in a general Islam class, or that it's relevant only to gender stuff, as if that's supposed to make any sense at all. My point is, if you teach an Islam class and don't usually assign this book, you're not teaching Islam right. You're going to have to fix that like yesterday. And no, not just an Islam class on gender, like an Islam and gender class. This is also an essential read for Introduction to Islam courses, Islamic ethics, contemporary Islam, historical Islam. This book is relevant to it. Dudes think that they don't have gender in the same way that white people don't think they have a race. And so that books on gender, especially if written by feminists, aren't relevant to their courses. And that attitude needs to be fixed. Also, a word on the title. I really don't like the word reflections in the title. The word reflection is dismissive. It's as if anything on gender written by a woman or a feminist must be reflections only, when in fact these are actual serious critical engagements with patriarchy, with Islam. It's an analysis. It's a scholarly thing to do. The chapters here are on marriage and its many facets, like the dower or mahar, sex, interreligious marriage. She talks about women's marriage to non-Muslims. Another chapter is on divorce. Of course, there's a chapter on sexual slavery, or the idea of having sex with raping, really, enslaved women. Illicit sexual acts like premarital sex, same-sex sexual relations, female genital cutting. Chapter 7 is called Female Bodies and Male Agency in the Qur'an, and it's one of my personal favorites. For me, personally and intellectually, the book also does something significant in other ways. It's an excellent reminder and also an excellent illustration of the hopefully now obvious fact that Islam, quote unquote, doesn't have to be just or only the interpretations of misogynistic dudes or misogynists, dead misogynists, who have interpreted the text, the Qur'an and Islam historically. If the misogynistic interpretations and practices of Islam are supposedly valid, and in my opinion they're not, then so are the feminist or the non-misogynistic, any non-misogynistic or egalitarian interpretations and practices of Islam too. And the book does this by totally questioning what the word Islamic even means. So what makes something Islamic? Is it in the Qur'an? And if so, is it clear or has it been debated? Is it Islamic because it's in the Hadith? Is it Islamic because it's in fiqh? And if it has been debated, who was involved in those debates? In my objective and professional opinion, something isn't Islamic just because a bunch of male scholars said so. And needless to say, any unprofessional words or phrases or tones that I use in this episode, as in any of my other ones, are my own and not the author's, and probably not endorsed by the author. There are several key points of this book that I want to highlight here before I get to specific points from each chapter. Okay, so first is the point about the inconsistent ways that Islam is defined and approached in questions of gender, sex, sexuality, women, men, feminism, and so on. So if we accept one hadith in Bukhari, like the idea that women must be sexually available for their husbands at all times, even if she's on the back of a camel, or even if she's at the stove or whatever, because it's Bukhari, and so many Muslims wrongly believe that everything in Bukhari's collection is correct, then what do we do with a hadith like the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ's consummation of his marriage with Aisha at the age of when she was 9 years old? If we claim that polygyny is allowed for all times and all contexts because the Qur'an authorizes it, then what do we do with something like slavery, which also the Qur'an permits? Whatever we do, we have to recognize that our interpretations are choices. They're not objective facts, but we choose from a set of options that are available to us. And so they're judgments that we make based on what hopefully our conscience is telling us is right. And we have to also recognize that whatever we do or whatever we choose, whatever interpretive choices we make, will come with consequences. And we have to be willing to recognize the impacts of those consequences. So one of Ali's recommendations, and there are many, is that our values be guided by, and I quote here, deep ethical reflection on the overarching divine purpose of human life on earth, to command what is right, to forbid what is wrong, to do good deeds, and to be ever conscious of God. And she says this on page 199 in the 2016 edition. A second point is that there's a gap between historical classical teachings and ideas of Islam and contemporary present-day values and actual sexual practices. And these gaps actually allow for a very fluid practice of Islam. A third point is that the question, who gets to speak about Islam authoritatively, especially when it comes to sex-related stuff? Fourth, what gets to count as Islamic? So, for example, while historical fiqh allows a father to marry off his daughter and his son, by the way, in some madhahib, without their consent, today's Muslims, like those with positions of power and authority, invoke hadiths on consent for marriage and do not allow child or forced marriages in theory anymore. A fifth point is that our understanding of Islam is very much rooted in what's important to us as a community or as a society at a given place and time. So Islam, in other words, never happens or is never practiced in a vacuum, as academics like to say. It's a product of larger things and phenomena. So for instance, historical fiqh took for granted the presence of something like slavery and developed a system of marriage that was very much founded on slavery. More specifically, for instance, a man was allowed to have sex with anyone that he owned or had ownership of, whether through marriage or slavery, and I'm so sorry for this language. Marriage was milk al-nikah, and slavery was milk al-yamin, so possession through marriage or nikah, or possession of the right hand, which is euphemism for slavery. Now, people think that just because slavery is no longer officially present, this conversation is irrelevant. But the book shows us that actually slavery remains integral, conceptually, to the regulations of marriage and marriage-related stuff. So the jurists, and in my opinion, shamelessly, used similar language for slavery as for marriage. So a husband gained access to his wife through mahar, sort of like a man gained sexual access to a woman by enslaving her, by purchasing her. And both could let go of the woman whenever they felt like it. Oh, and people often ask, so are you saying that all the scholars of the past are wrong just because they said these things about women? Yes, I am. Is it not possible for all people to be wrong about something? They were all also wrong about slavery and child marriage and wife beating, because they all allowed these things, these very, very wrong and unethical and, in my opinion, un-Islamic things. So yes, they could all be wrong. And it's possible to reject what they had to say on those things and adopt new ideas and move toward a more ethical kind of Islam, which is what this book is doing for us. So, fun fact, did you know that Al-Ghazali, who everybody loves for some reasons that I can't appreciate, advises a man who can't afford to marry a free woman but has sexual urges, and so he wants to satisfy them, to go ahead and marry a woman who is enslaved by another man, basically marry a slave woman, so that at least he won't masturbate. So for Ghazali, in other words, marrying an enslaved woman whose kids will be enslaved if you marry her is a lesser evil than zina or masturbation. That is why not everything that dead dudes had to say about Islam is Islamic. Now, there are gems in each chapter, so let's walk through each of them, beginning with the intro. So in the introduction, we get the whole point of the book. Obviously, we get the problems with the idea of the status of women in Islam and the different ways that this phrase is often approached and imagined, depending on who is talking. And we also get the problem with the phrase Islam and the West, or Islam versus the West, as if the two are mutually exclusive, as if there's no such thing as Western Muslims or Western Islam, as if the two are inherently contradictory or in a constant battle with each other, because they're not. Basically, you get an either or. Either Islam is oppressive and the Muslim woman is a poor, oppressed woman who needs saving by the colonizer, or now the descendants of the colonizer, or the Muslim woman is a queen and royalty, and that's why you can't shake her hands. And Islam is the best religion in the world that treats women like precious little diamonds and pearls and covered lollipops. The worst of the West in practice is compared with the best of Islam in theory, as if that is supposed to make any sense, and as if Muslim women don't literally have identical problems that women anywhere in the world have. So the Muslim woman is juxtaposed against the Western woman, presumably non-Muslim woman, the Western woman being the oppressed one because look how she has to show skin, and look how her boyfriend won't marry her, and look how her husband cheats on her, as opposed, I guess, to polygamy, and so on. In both cases, Muslim women are talked about either by Western feminist women or by Western misogynist men or by Muslim misogynist men. Muslim women are never talked to in either case. The introduction also highlights the point that the way that Islam talks about marriage, wifely obedience, slavery, etc., is not unique to Islam. Other religions and religious texts, including biblical texts, have had nearly identical ways of talking about these things as well. So, for example, did you know that up until the end of the 20th century, Christian wedding vows included a statement on wifely obedience because it was that important to the biblical idea of a wife? And in the introduction also, the author explained why she's engaging these very, very old texts in the first place. One of the reasons is because of the assumptions that shape these texts. And here, I'm going to quote the author. So she says, in part, this book is an attempt to demonstrate that constructive and critical engagement with the Islamic intellectual heritage can be important in providing a framework for renewed and invigorated Muslim ethical thought, end quote. In other words, the tradition does offer a lot that's valuable, especially for moving forward, for considering new ways of practicing Islam, new ethical, better, egalitarian, more just ways of practicing Islam. And to quote the author again, she says, a careful investigation of the legal tradition illustrates that some of the doctrines taken for granted as quote-unquote Islamic emerged at a particular time and place as a result of human interpretive endeavor and need not be binding for all times, end quote. So these men's interpretations of Islam aren't all there is to Islam, and they don't have to be followed by us eternally and universally. And this new knowledge now also authorizes us Muslims today of all kinds to continue that tradition of interpretation. Now on chapter 1, which is called Marriage, Money, and Sex. So we're going to talk about mahar and nafaqah, which is spousal maintenance. And I want us to prepare for some very, very unacceptable things that the fiqh tells us about marriage and mahar and divorce. It's going to make you really angry, but it'll also reinforce the need for a feminist or egalitarian or ethical fiqh, and also the death of patriarchy. So it's ultimately not so bad, I think. First on mahar. So mahar is something that virtually all Muslims agree theoretically is required of husbands to give to wives at the time of marriage. Virtually all Muslims also agree that husbands are required in Islam to financially provide for their wives and children, their families. Yet in practice, neither is universally or necessarily true. And most Muslim women that you know probably can speak to that. Now, the author's focus is on U.S. Muslims or Muslims in America, where Muslim wives largely contribute financially to their households. And this isn't just an American thing. Muslim women, as women generally anywhere in the world, universally contribute financially to their households. So the central argument of this chapter, which is very much related to the rest of the book, is that the arguments that are used by Muslim scholars and often adopted by regular lay Muslims, ordinary Muslims, to insist that classical rules on marriage in Islam be followed because, they're Islamic and all, are actually not compatible with other commonly held ideas about marriage. These rules, these theoretical doctrines, don't take into account the contexts of people living in today's world, whether in the United States or contemporary Muslims anywhere else. So the author suggests, and I agree, that we may need to reconsider the ways that we think about dower or mahar, spousal support, and women's interreligious marriage, the themes that she covers in this chapter, so that a more ethical, more egalitarian structure of marriage is made possible. And again, the Islamic tradition provides us with the foundation to make these new ways or new avenues possible. So let's talk about some of the specific themes of the chapter. We'll begin with mahar. Did you know that the purpose of mahar is actually for the wife to provide exclusive sexual access to her husband, to the man who has given her the mahar? It's literally called thaman al-bud'a. In some of the fiqh, literally translates to price of the vulva. Mahar wasn't invented by Islam or by Muslim jurists or the fuqaha or Muslim scholars. It was a common practice in Arabia before Islam, and it was viewed as a gift to the bride's family in exchange for considering her children as belonging to the father's tribe rather than to the mother's tribe. So mahar was a symbolic thing given in exchange of some form of property or control. The Muslim jurists kept the idea of mahar, but they gave it a different meaning, and we can do this today as well. So instead of making it about children or lineage, or essentially purchasing lineage rights, they made it about sexual access to the wife. This is not a Quranic idea, though, although that's debatable because apparently everything in the Qur'an is open to debate. But for sure, the Qur'an does not force the woman to accept mahar. The fiqh forces the woman or requires the woman to accept her mahar in order for her to stay married to the husband. And now you understand why. It's because he basically can't have sexual access to his wife if she won't accept the mahar. Oh, and we also learn in the chapter on divorce that women actually have to return their mahar if they initiate the divorce, or if they get what is called a khula. So here's a breakdown of mahar, okay? According to fiqh, a bride accepts mahar from the groom in exchange for giving him sexual access. She's entitled to mahar so long as she is giving him sexual access. If she chooses to divorce him, then she has to return the mahar to him. There are exceptions, and we'll talk about that in a bit. And that's because she's choosing to deny him sexual access. If he himself initiates the divorce, however, then she gets to still keep the mahar because she's not the one making the decision to not give him access. Basically, the symbolism of mahar is problematic. The author suggests that if the dower or mahar is supposed to be intended as economic security for the wife, like some Muslims in America think, then it's probably more ethical not to attach it to things like consummation, and perhaps something like wages lost and earning potential and the length of the marriage and childbearing and such should be the things taken into account instead. In my opinion, as feminists, we can keep mahar if we want as an Islamic thing, but we would just give it a whole different meaning because, again, it's symbolism, it's symbolic. Just like the fuqaha did. They took a pre-existing thing and gave it a whole different meaning. And this new meaning that we attach to mahar can be something that reflects our egalitarian values or ethical values rather than the patriarchal ideas of a woman's body or as the husband's sexual property. Let's now talk about another theme from this chapter, nafaqah, or spousal maintenance or support. Today's Muslims explain nafaqah as, well, the husband works and provides financially for the family, and the wife takes care of the kids and the home. But that's not what the classical jurists reasoned. For them, the wife gets nafaqah in exchange for sex with the husband. They actually do not require the wife to take care of the kids or the household stuff at all. She has only one obligation, and that is to be available sexually for her husband whenever he wants it, regardless of her own interests and wishes and feelings and needs. And this is important because the jurists agreed that the wife does not have the right to demand sex from her husband whenever and however she feels like it. So he's not required to have sex with her whenever she wants. So it's not reciprocal. He can have sex with her either occasionally or whenever he wants to. She, on the other hand, is required to grant him access to her body and vagina whenever he wants. But that doesn't mean that the wife has no rights sexually whatsoever. So let's talk about sex now, which is another theme in this chapter. Muslims be like, hey, look how sex-friendly Islam is, while invoking fiqh ideas on sex. But like, did you know that while that's somewhat true, it's men's sexual needs that are prioritized? And female sexuality is recognized, yes, but mostly in a negative way. Like, shit, let's regulate women's sexuality and make sure that her husband is sexually satisfying her, or else she'll cause fitna. The bad kind, not the feminist kind that I try to produce. And destroy families by sleeping with other men because, good God, women and their extremely high sex drive. They literally thought this, y'all. And it's also not framed as the wife's right, but as a part of the husband's obligation. It's his duty that if he fails to fulfill, the wife's sexual desires will create a fitna in society because women's sex drive is that high, they said. But yes, they did stress the obligation of the man to make his wife orgasm. Hashtag dear dudes. But so much for the whole, oh my God, the fiqh totes recognizes and honors a woman's sexual needs. Don't get too excited about that. The woman as a temptress trope is nothing to be excited about. It's nothing to appreciate. This is how it works, okay? Men need to satisfy their wives because if not, we women will go out into the world and seek satisfaction by other means, tempting innocent, precious men whose wives aren't satisfying them, so that we end up having sex with the men that we're not married to and destroy other families and the whole of society because we're powerful like that. But note how the woman is the evil one in both cases, no matter what she does. As the wife of man A, where A isn't sexually satisfying us, our strong, uncontrollable sex drive will tempt us to go and seek sexual intercourse with man B, who will agree to have sex with us because his wife isn't sexually satisfying him. The second woman is why all women need to be sexually available for their husbands. The first woman is why women's sexual activity needs to be regulated. Bad, bad women. And this isn't just a classical thing. Talk about the classical ideas still affecting our lives today. Today's Muslims largely still think or insist that the wife needs to be readily available to her husband whenever he wants. And yet, the power of women's high sex drive isn't recognized in the contemporary. Oh, and fun fact, and this isn't from the book, it's me talking. If your wife doesn't like to have sex with you, or if you know a woman who doesn't like sex, while I can't speak conclusively to that, I can assure you that it's because you're not doing a good job sexually satisfying her. So do better, and she'll probably want more sex with you. And we know that there's no shortage of hadiths that talk about or demand that wives be sexually available for their husbands at all times. We will talk another time about the falsity of those hadiths because clearly those hadiths are invented by dudes who weren't interested in satisfying or who weren't able to sexually satisfy their wives so that the wives would not look forward to sex with them. So they decided to attribute their rage and misogyny to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and lo and behold, it worked. Oh, and here's an interesting and really wonderful fact. Sex by force, or marital rape in this case, while not haram, was still viewed as unethical by the jurists. So even though they said wives are supposed to be sexually available to their husbands, they still viewed marital rape, or a husband forcing himself on his wife, as unethical. But all of that said, the wife was still considered entitled to sex from her husband. Almost all of the madhahib, or almost all of the legal schools, agreed that impotence, for example, was reasonable grounds for divorce. But here's the catch. The wife could leave her husband only if he isn't able to consummate the marriage. Once consummation has occurred, she can't use impotence against him later on to get a divorce. The final theme of this chapter is intermarriage. It's one of my favorite things to talk about. This refers to marriage between Muslims and the people of the book, understood as Christians and Jews. There's a very long debate in the Islamic tradition, Sunni, because Shia scholars didn't allow any man's marriage to any non-Muslim person. But generally, they didn't prohibit men's marriage to non-Muslims in the way that they did women's. This is a topic of my current research, so I'm very, very passionate about this, and I promise to come back to it, and we'll talk about it in more detail later. But for now, fun fact, and this is not from the book, it's from my research, it turns out that Islam does allow women to marry people of the book, contrary to everything that everyone and their imam has told you. The author tells us that Quranic verse 5:5 or chapter 5, verse number 5, Al-Ma'idah, grants explicit permission for men to marry people of the book, but no explicit prohibition for women exists in the Qur'an. Quranic verse 221 of Surah Al-Baqarah of the second chapter prohibits all Muslims from marrying all mushriks. And fun fact, and this is very important, the scholars have never agreed on the definition of the word mushrik, of who's included and who's not. And Quranic verse 10 of chapter 60, so 60:10, prohibits women from returning to their kuffar husbands. And also, that verse also prohibits men's marriage to kuffar women, tells them that they need to not stay married to their kuffar wives. Nobody talks about that ever. Now talk about selectively relying on fiqh ideas and such. While the majority of the scholars historically understood these verses collectively to prohibit women from marrying all non-Muslims while allowing men to marry virtuous women of the people of the book, and they also historically claimed that a marriage is automatically dissolved if a non-Muslim woman converts to Islam while her husband remains a non-Muslim. Today's Muslims have a different view on the latter part. There was a historical minority view that a woman who has converted to Islam and is married to a non-Muslim for years, a man who refuses to convert to Islam or who does not convert to Islam, can stay married to this non-Muslim husband of hers. Many scholars today support this view, even though it was historically a minority view, because they think that divorce and breaking the family apart is the bigger evil in this case than staying married to a non-Muslim. It was historically assumed that it makes total sense to forbid a Muslim woman from marrying any non-Muslim man while allowing a man to marry a Christian or a Jewish woman. That no longer makes sense, of course. It's not an obvious choice anymore. But here's the logic of the prohibition. Again, we go back to the scholar's conception of marriage as a form of slavery, milk and nikah, right? Ownership or dominion over someone through nikah. Two significant, very, very, very un-Quranic assumptions are the pillars of this very un-Quranic prohibition. And the un-Quranic is my word. It's not the author's word. She's far more careful and professional about how she talks about what's Islamic and what's not. I'm not, and we have different audiences. And these two assumptions are: all men are superior to all women, and all Muslims are superior to all non-Muslims. Every woman has to obey her husband. Remember the whole wifely obedience nonsense that we talked about earlier? Yeah, that's instrumental to this prohibition. For these men, for the fuqaha, marriage between a Muslim woman and a non-Muslim man would disrupt the hierarchy that they read into Islam, because both spouses are superior to each other in some way. The wife because she's Muslim, and the man, the husband, because he's a male. However, marriage between Muslim men and non-Muslim women makes perfect sense because, according to the hierarchy, the man is superior because he's a man, and he's superior because he is Muslim. Do you see how brilliantly that works out in favor of the patriarchy? Exactly. And again, today's Muslim scholars seem to agree. I don't think it's a huge agreement, but there's a general sense of agreement that, contrary to what the fiqh says, right, what the majority view in the fiqh says, if a woman converts to Islam and is married to a non-Muslim man, then she doesn't have to leave her husband, and their marriage is not dissolved. The historical scholars said, nah, the prohibition that they invented out of their mouths was so important that no marriage between a Muslim woman and a non-Muslim man can ever be legitimate, no matter what. But again, there was a minority view that has now become the majority, it looks like, right? There's literally no evidence and no good reasons for why women cannot marry other monotheists like Muslim men can. I highly recommend, especially this section of the book, because there's very little research on the topic currently. I do have a blog post on it, and I do have an article coming out on it soon, inshallah, and I discuss this in my dissertation, and I will have a book on this eventually. So you're welcome to ask me for recommendations or resources if you're looking for more on this topic until the episode on this comes out. And then in the conclusion of this chapter, the author provides what I think are excellent suggestions for moving forward for what we can do about the problems that are raised in this chapter, like alternative, more egalitarian, more ethical ways of thinking about mahar, divorce, marriage, sex, and so on. After all, and this is my thought, there's literally no reasons to think that the historical scholars' opinions and interpretations of Islam are any more Islamic than our own. So alternatives are possible and certainly needed, and they too can be Islamic. Okay, so I will pause here and continue chapter 2 in the next episode, inshallah. The bottom line so far, this book is an excellent read, highly recommended. Pick it up if you can and have fun with it. Salam.